Worthy. Why don't you guys go ahead and grab a seat? Thanks for singing with us this morning. You know, in the office here, I have been accused of being a Scrooge or not being festive, relating to some of my comments on Christmas decorations and things like that. The closest thing Talcy and I had to a prenuptial agreement was that before we got married, I said, if you want to decorate for Christmas, you can. I won't. And that was it. That was like the biggest thing. Once we established that, we were good to get married. I do, rings on, all that. Actually, we don't have rings. I don't know why I just said that. But anyways, I've seen Sarah and Mackenzie. If you guys are here at team night, Sarah's like crazy blue Christmas sweater, really nice. The other day I saw Mackenzie wearing a Christmas sweater. I noticed that it was not the first one I'd seen her wearing. I said, Mackenzie, how many Christmas sweaters do you own? And her response was, like, including cardigans or not. And she starts going, like, I imagine you go to her house and she's probably got them like cataloged by like a Dewey Decimal System for like different types and cuts and all that. So anyways, I got this thing at some Mennonite thrift store a few years ago for $3. And try to call me a Scrooge while I'm wearing this thing. So I might break into hives from how scratchy it is while we're here this morning. But I'm going to do something this morning that I'm not usually going to do. I grew up in, like, as I've mentioned before, a really charismatic church, and maybe it's also kind of like the time it was in history, but it's very common. I don't know if any of you grew up in a church like this, where it's like, turn to your neighbor and say this, or, let me hear you say this, and you had to say a lot of things, right? Kept you on your toes. I'm not going to do that a lot. But this morning, I am going to get you guys to say something with me, and that something is going to show up on the screen, and it's a quick, short little phrase. It goes like this: it's not all about me. It's not all about me. Okay, so you guys got to brace yourselves. I worked at a Baptist church. I know what it's like. Here at E-Free Church, maybe it's like a little bit more, but we're usually quiet. It's usually one person talking. But anyways, going to get you guys to brace yourself. We're all going to say this together, okay? I'll show you one more time how it goes. It's not all about me. Okay, you guys ready? It's never been easier to cheat, right? You got masks on. You're like, he doesn't know if I'm saying it or not. Just move your head a little bit. It looks like you're saying. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. It's not all about me. All right, that's not bad. But I feel like if it really wasn't all about you, you'd give it a little bit more gusto. So one more time. 1, 2, 3. It's not all about me. Well done. All right, well, maybe you find those words hard to say. Maybe you don't believe them yet. But hopefully, as we look at some of Jesus' teachings this morning, we'll start to believe these words even more. I think that this is the type of phrase, as we read through the Gospel of Matthew, we work through that, we could come back to time and time again and say, wow, I need to live in a life where I recognize that it's not all about me. Those are hard words. I mean, for me, I'm a full-fledged millennial. Like, there's so many things where I'm like, yeah, that's like the millennial and me coming out. And we are such an entitled generation. I'm not speaking negatively about you. I'm speaking negatively about us. We're so entitled. We're so consumer-driven everywhere in our lives, in our families, in our relationships, even in the church, right? Like, it's just like, I don't really like that church because of this. And we want it to be the way we want it to be. And if it's not, then we're upset and we get offended and all that. And I don't know what the future is for Gen Zers yet. We haven't totally finally figured out all their characteristics, but I'm assuming that they're going to be a little bit like us millennials and follow in our pathways and be very entitled and live in a world where it feels like the whole universe orbits around us. I think when we read the gospel, we realize that that's like the opposite way of thinking that Jesus would call his followers to think. We're going to be looking at a passage today as we're continuing on in the Sermon on the Mount. Guys, we are getting close to finishing chapter 5 of Matthew. That's crazy. We've only been at it for several months, but we're wrapping this up. Matthew 5, verses 38 to 42. And why don't we read it together now, and then we'll kind of hop back into it. Here's Jesus talking. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. It's not all about me." So what I want to do is I want to just look at this first verse, and then we'll kind of take it from there. Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth." You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. What Jesus is talking about is this thing called the lex talionis, which you don't have to remember those words, but it's this ancient teaching, and that comes from the Roman world, but that many cultures had: Babylonian culture, Roman culture, Jewish culture, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And we say that nowadays. We think that sounds kind of vindictive and harsh. But one of the things I celebrate, because what Jesus is talking about, he's talking about like Deuteronomy 19. He's talking about like the law you find in the Old Testament, where God was laying out a legal system. Remember that in the Old Testament, what we read about is a type of government system called a theocracy. What that means is it's not a monarchy, it's not a parliamentary system, it's a theocracy. That means a god, theos, a god, a divinity, is the one that's ruling as the king. This is the way God set it up with his people. He's like, hey, you guys, I'm gonna make the commands, I'm gonna make the rules, I'm gonna make the laws, and I'm gonna lead you guys. That's a really great idea when you've got the God of the universe doing this. The gods of like ancient mythology, Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Babylonian mythology, were these vindictive, jealous, contentious gods. But the God of the Bible is this compassionate, loving God who wants to rule and reign over his people. He wants to run their governance. It's a great idea. However, as you read the Old Testament, the people basically stage a coup, and they're like, no, we need a human king. That'd be way cooler than having a God as a king, right? So they get a human king, and things change. But when this law was instated, it was God as king. And I don't know if you guys were here when we were looking at Matthew 5:17 through 20. What we're looking at is the character and nature of God. This is a holy God. Above all other things, we talk about God being love, compassion, like all these attributes and characteristics, but at his core, God is a holy God, and out of his holiness, he operates in these different characteristics, these different attributes: love, compassion, grace, mercy, and all that. And we love talking about, the kindness, the love, and that's all very real. One of the things we can celebrate when we come to a passage like this is that the God of the Bible is a just God. He is a God of justice. And we don't always love that nowadays. More and more, I think church culture is kind of like, we want to go to kind of like the softer, like lamb stroking kind of Jesus God, and we want this kind of more chill God like that. And we don't really like this idea of justice and judgment that much. And it leads to like growing ideas like universalism, if you know what that is. It's this, I'll say, false teaching that people have adopted. It's a misunderstanding of God's grace that says that, well, because God's kind and God's loving, at the end, everyone's going to just be forgiven and like spend eternity with Jesus. And that sounds like all good and fine until two things. One, you die and you go to heaven and you're greeted by like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, and you're like, oh shoot, maybe this wasn't that good of a theological idea. And not that I actually know who's where or whatever. Those guys could have repented, and God's grace is bigger than all of that. But it doesn't really work when we think about the great injustices of the world not being met with justice. It also doesn't work when we understand that there are people who don't want God's forgiveness. God offers forgiveness, and we can choose to accept it or reject it. God, in the end, doesn't force his forgiveness on people. God is a God of justice, and we read this eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Culturally, we're kind of like, oh, that sounds harsh. If you read what's going on in the Old Testament, what's actually going on here is God's setting up a boundary he's setting up a system in which people can be just, like their justice system can like make sure things are fair and right and equitable, but he's also drawing a boundary. Because for us, our justice that we want in life, what we want back when we're wronged, is often like more so revenge than justice. It's usually justice plus one, right? Like you slap me, I'll punch you. You punch me, I'll stab you. You steal my cow, I'll take 2 cows back. You steal my dog, I'll take your cat. No. Just needed that one to get out there for a second. All right, got it. All the dog owners leave. There's this issue when God's giving this law in the Old Testament that people were like taking advantage of people. It's like they've wronged me. And God's like, yeah, we should be just, but they were going above and beyond. And this is actually a really cool representation of God's equitable justice. But he goes on, he says this in verse 39. He says, you've heard this. God is a God of justice. Be just. As God is ruling your people, if someone wrongs someone, then yes, the local court, the local authorities should bring justice, but it should be fair. It should be reasonable. It should be like in return for the wrong that was done. Jesus says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. This word resist in the original language really means like to oppose, like to go toe to toe. When someone's like evil to you, to kind of like stand up and fight against and try to like get back at them. Jesus says, don't do that. This is kind of confusing because we're supposed to believe in justice, but then Jesus says, well, if someone's evil or someone's doing wrong to you, don't really sweat it. Don't stand up against them. And I think there's kind of this like tricky balance here because as followers of Jesus, we're not supposed to like just watch injustice happen in the world, right? Like we're not supposed to, this part of what our Believe campaign is going on. There is brokenness in the world. We should stand up for that. We should stand up for the marginalized. We should stand up for those who are struggling. We should stand up for the oppressed. We should stand up in that way. However, Jesus is saying, when it comes to yourself, which is usually where we become the most concerned about injustice, he's like, maybe there's room to chill out a little bit. Maybe there's room to like fight for your own rights a little bit less. And what I want to do this morning is Jesus goes through these 4 kind of like interesting, like super specific scenarios. This is like probably one of the thickest, most action-packed passages in the Sermon on the Mount. As I was preparing this week, I was like, why didn't we break this into 6 weeks? But then I was like, well, some people might be like, man, we're already going slowly enough. But there's a lot. Jesus expresses these 4 scenarios. And what I want to do this morning is I actually want to look at this kind of like as though we're like together, think tanking, kind of writing a blog together. And then at the end, we're going to just look at quickly at a phrase from one of Paul's letters. And we'll kind of wrap up there, hopefully zeroing in on this idea that it's not all about me. Have you ever read those blogs that are like, 4 ways for this, or 5 ways for that, or 8 ways for... It was like 7 ways to make your hair flow like Thor's, or 8 ways to not bore people to death while you're preaching. And I'm just like spitballing random ideas. This isn't like my browser history this week or anything, but this morning I want to write a blog with you guys. 4 ways to respond when being wronged. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, I think these are 4 ways to respond when being wronged. Jesus is going to go through 4 scenarios here where you're wronged, or maybe what you think is fair or what you deserve is being challenged, and he's going to show us how we could respond. So first of all, in verse 39, here he says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Jesus paints the scenario. He says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, you're like, not during COVID, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And before you get excited, this does not mean if someone slaps you on the face, you get to moon them, okay? If someone... Yeah, okay. If anyone, that's good. I told Talcy yesterday, so that's okay. Anyways, if anyone slaps on the right cheek, turns them the other also. This is a really interesting statement. And again, there's this kind of interesting like balance. It's like, okay, are we supposed to be like such pacifists that we just get abused? It's just like, hey, we just go out and we just get beat up and we put up with that kind of injustice. I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at here. It's interesting how he says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek. Historically, what's going on here is there's this assumption in the ancient world that everyone's right-handed, right? Like, and even now today, most people are right-handed, right? Then there are like those weirdos who are kind of doing the other thing. But in the ancient world, the assumption is that everyone is right-handed. And so when Jesus says someone slaps you on the right cheek, what that implies is that it's a backhanded slap. One of the things you have to understand is that culturally, that's like a degrading, insulting, demeaning type of slap. In this context, you actually could like slap, like especially as like the man of a household. I'm not agree with this, but as a man of a household in this culture, you could slap your slaves, you could slap your children, you could slap your wife, you could slap your workers and things like that. You could beat people, or if you're an official, people who are below you, you could discipline them in that way. But if you were to wind up backhand and do that, that's like, if I get Don up here and I slap him, open hand, that's like, okay, hey, do a better job as like the chair of the board, okay, Don? But if I do it backhanded in front of you guys, you're like, whew. Don was just degraded in front of us. Ryan just stripped away who he was. He just demeaned him at the core. Who's Jesus talking to? Jesus is talking to his homies. He's talking to people around him who he knows are going to be persecuted, who are going to be challenged, who are going to be hurt, insulted for their faith. Jesus talked about that earlier on. Rejoice and be glad when people persecute you. And this idea of turning the other cheek is kind of saying, when someone slaps you like that, just know that there's another one coming. Good chance there's probably another one coming. How do we respond to that usually? Well, unless you're a way better human than me, the way I respond to that is I want to get back at someone. How do I make that right? How do I demand justice in that situation? What do we know about someone? What could we assume about someone who comes and just winds up and backhands you across the face, who demeans you in front of people, who tries to abuse you and bring hurt to you? Well, that's probably been their experience in life. What usually doesn't change someone who's doing that, like if I wind up and hit them back, I mean, I'm not that strong, so it probably wouldn't change much anyways, but like you hurt someone back, that's not usually the moment, the aha moment where they're like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm totally convicted of my wrong now. I want to follow Jesus. The first way to respond when being wronged, I'll say, is grace. If we really, in a situation like that, where someone is hurting us, where they're heaping on abuse, where they're doing something to demean us, we have to ask ourselves, am I more concerned about getting what's right for me, or am I concerned about the brokenness in their world? You want to change something in someone's life? Jesus turns all these cultural ideas about how to respond in these types of conflicting times or when we're hurt and when we're wronged upside down. If you read the end of Romans 12, verses 17 through 21, it's a great parallel for this passage. This idea that we're not supposed to take revenge, but leave room for God's justice. Do we trust God that he's a God of justice? Do we trust that he'll deal with that? And our role in life isn't to represent God's justice and judgment. We're not the judge. Our role is to represent his grace and his love and his kindness to people. Jesus has called us into that important mission, to join him in restoring all things. And we do that by extending grace rather than hatred, grace rather than animosity or our own vindictive justice. Jesus says, leave revenge on the shelf. When a broken, hurting person who's probably been hurt people, you know the cliche. What do you care more about? Getting what's yours or seeing that person restored? Turn the other cheek. Verse 40. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Some of your translations might say your tunic and your cloak. What the tunic or the shirt is it's like a common undergarment that was worn in that day. And this is actually an interesting scenario compared to the first one, because the first one we're more looking at probably abuse or someone just being degrading to someone. It's really undeserved abuse. This one is if someone's suing you and they win your shirt, which is something you could take the shirt off someone's back. You could sue them for that back in the day. There's a chance that maybe you actually are in the wrong a little bit. Maybe there's this, in this situation, this is not hey, that person just came up and abused me. This is maybe I did kind of mess up. And I think this is kind of the nuanced part of life that most of us often live in conflict. Conflict isn't usually just that person did all that bad stuff, I did nothing, and we're good to go, or vice versa. Usually, some of us have a little bit of skin in the game, right? Usually it's maybe it's 90-10, maybe it's 80-20. A lot of our issues are 50-50. And a lot of times, even just by the ways that we respond to people's brokenness is where we step in with our own issues. It's not that common that it's just hey, this person's totally messed up and I'm just this perfect representation of Jesus here who's never done anything wrong. That's not, we like to think about that, and we can think about everything they've done wrong. You guys ever watch shows like Judge Judy? I don't know, you don't have to admit that, but you see her you see these two characters that are in court and they're fighting it out, and you start to side with the one because maybe you like them or the way they speak. You don't know anything about it. You don't know what actually happened. And then Judge Judy just she just loads up and unleashes on them, and she just rips on them. And I'm I never want to go to court if this is what it's actually like. That woman is so scary. But we love it. We love seeing that person just get railed on by Judge Judy because we're oh, they're wrong. That's such an upside down way of thinking. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. But then he goes further with this give them your coat as well thing. See, in Roman court, you could sue someone for that shirt, but usually the coat was off limits, out of bounds. You couldn't actually take the coat off someone's back. And Jesus says, you know what? Someone's suing you, you're maybe in the wrong. Just go above and beyond. Just say, hey, you know what? Let me. This is a huge lesson. My wife has helped me learn this a lot. Is when I'm going into times of conflict, even if it's man, that person is so messed up and it's their issue, looking for the spaces in which I can own my own stuff first and create a pathway for reconciliation. And I'll say the second way to respond is humility. Is saying, how can I lead? We want people to apologize to us, right? Someone's messed up, they've done this thing, and we're waiting, and we want them to do that. But we're willing to give very little. And even if it's only 5% our issue, 10% our issue, 15% our issue, 20% our issue. This idea of giving your coat is just this radical, generous, humble idea of saying, hey, I'm more concerned about the restoration of this relationship. I'm more concerned about helping you know how to apologize. I'm more concerned about the healing that goes on in your heart than being the one that's right. I'm more concerned about that than hearing my apology first. Man, we go into situations like that and we're just oh, that person's got to pay. They got to say sorry. It's all them. And what we should be doing is just clearing our debts and maybe even a little bit more. Jesus is basically saying, if you get sued for $1,000, you know what? Just give them $1,500. I don't know, like whatever. It's just money. It's more important to invest into the restoration of all things. It's more important to invest into people. It's more important to invest into that than try to nickel and dime and get what's yours. Just give them the shirt off your back. Verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. So what we've seen is like a situation of like just unmerited abuse. And then one where there's maybe like a possible like chance that you actually do owe something. And here what we see is this like maybe like overreach of authority in this stretch. And Jesus says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them this extra mile. Culturally, Jesus is touching on a lot of like historical cultural things here. In that time, remember, Israel is like imperialized by the Roman Empire. They were taken by the Babylonians, passed over to the Persians, and now they're with the Romans, and they're kind of like speed dating these different like empires that are imperializing them. And in Roman culture there, the Israelites had some of their own culture, but they lived under Roman rule. And there were definitely levels of citizens here. If you were a Jewish person, as a Roman, I could come up to you and I could demand that you like carry my stuff for me. If I've got my suitcase or something, it's just like, hey, I need you to carry this bag for me. But the maximum I could make you go is 1 mile. That was the Roman rule. It's like 1 mile, you can make a Jewish person go 1 mile with you. Imagine how much that would suck. I mean, you're just like, I'm late for work, you're on your way somewhere, and some Roman comes up to you and is like, hey, actually, I'm headed the opposite direction, but could you just like carry my stuff for me for 1 mile? That's terrible, man. When Jesus came, the people of Israel were expecting this Messiah, this Christ, this chosen one. And he came in such unexpected ways. I mean, around Christmas, we think about the Christmas story, and he's born in this weird way, and it doesn't make sense. But the Jewish nation, what they're waiting for is this person to come and liberate them from the evil Romans. I mean, why wouldn't Jesus come and do that? I mean, the Roman Empire is brutal and evil, and they're waiting for him to come and overthrow them. What does Jesus say here? Hey, if the Romans are oppressing you, just let them go a little further. That's crazy. I think there's this assumption there. Read this in some commentaries. It's a really interesting idea. If I'm a Jewish person and I carry this Romans person gear for 1 mile, the idea is that when I put it down, they might ask someone else to do it. So if I were to say, well, why don't I just go 2 miles? Some translators would say that's actually Jesus saying go 2 extra miles, so maybe go 3 miles, triple it. The idea would be, well, someone's going to have to do it. So why not me instead of someone else? Why don't I just take it? That's like, I was convicted of this yesterday. I opened up a new loaf of bread, and I do what all of us do. I reach in, and do I grab the first slice? No, absolutely not. Who wants that, right? I know there's some weirdo in the room that's like, I like those the best. No, but just stick with the analogy. That's crazy. I do what everyone does. You reach around until you get to the end, and they're like the 2 garbage pieces at the end together, and then someone's just like, oh my. And I was actually convicted. I was like, my reach around is really just saying, what's going to happen is Talie's going to eat it at some point because she's a better human being than me. And that's a crazy example, but how often do we live with that mentality where it's just like, if I do, then what will it cost others? Or if I don't, then what will it how do I, when I come to church, am I looking for the best spot? Or when I go somewhere, am I looking for the best parking spot? Or when you're at the pizza party, you're getting the biggest piece of pizza? Or are you saying, man, you know what? Maybe I'll leave that for someone else. These are kind of weird examples, but how often do we live with this mentality that it's like, what can I do now that will benefit others later, even if they don't see it? What wasn't going to happen was that second, I don't think in the 2nd and 3rd mile, that Jewish person going the extra mile would be like, hey, everyone, just so you know, you don't have to carry the stuff because I'm doing it, extra mile here, got the extra mile shirt or something like that. No, it's they're just doing it to serve one another and also to look the oppressor in the eye and respond in this 3rd way with servanthood. We do that in the church a lot, right? It's we talk about volunteering at Kids Town and we're like, oh, someone else will do it. Wow. It sounds great until we realize, oh, maybe someone else is thinking that and we could be someone else. We think about that when we think about giving to the Believe campaign or giving to the mission of the church or serving in our community or doing all these things. It's just there's so much that we think that other people can do. And I want to make a quick note too. Just kind of contextually with where we're at now, I'm apolitical. I want to lead a church that's apolitical. I don't want to take stances on this. It's pretty easy, I think, for us to right now be like, I get it. All the changing rules are wearying and it's tough. And, maybe you like the rules, maybe you don't like the rules. And, we want to argue about it. Jesus comes and he's speaking to a culture that is totally politically oppressed. And we're talking about this as a staff this week. Like I don't prefer wearing a mask. If I did, I would have been doing it for the first 35 years of my life, right? Like, I could have done that. I don't prefer it. Man, shortly after this, who's going to be in rule? Nero, ruling Rome. Do you know what the church capacity was when Nero was in charge? 0, right? Punishable by death if you attend, right? And it's so easy for us to get distracted by, this isn't right, this isn't fair, I'm not getting what's mine, this is uncomfortable. And I get it, like, you can have those feelings, but at the end of the day, when those distract us from the gospel and our ability to serve and to just humbly offer grace and to look the oppressor in the eye and say, you know what, I'll just serve. I don't know, man. I just think we don't have it sometimes as bad as we think we do. And even when we do, Jesus says right there's an opportunity to model my kingdom. Verse 41. If anyone, we did that. We'll do verse 42 now. It comes after that. Give to the one who asks you and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is an interesting closing because in these first 3, Jesus is talking about like an abuser, someone who's suing you, an oppressor, like people probably like from like a position of authority and power. Then he flips it at the end. He says, but even those below you, he's talking to like an honor-shame culture where someone above you or below you had a huge impact, right? Like someone above you tells you do something, you have to do it. Someone below you does that? No. And the early church had all the same excuses we have to not give, to not be generous, to not do things like that. When people ask for things, when people express needs, they had all the same excuses we have. Oh, someone else will do it, or this, or what. And, there's a lot of like philosophical debate that can be, talked around like, well, do you give to panhandlers because of this and all these, and it's all fine. There's room to practice wisdom, but beyond that, I think the greatest call here that Jesus offers us is one of radical generosity. You are in a sense being wronged when someone comes and asks you for something that doesn't belong to you. Like it's not fair. Like you worked for it, it's yours, right? But the greatest thing you can do with what's been given to you is model what it looks like to follow Jesus and participate in his not normal kingdom. Think about this. You are one of the richest people that's ever existed in the history of humankind. You might be like, oh, Ryan, you don't know I don't care what your situation is. You might be the poorest person in this room. Compared to the history of humankind, compared to where we're at globally, you are just one of the richest people ever. You got a cell phone in your pocket. You're just paying more for that every month than most people live off of. We are some of the richest people. And that's not all bad as long as we recognize the calling that Jesus... Why did Jesus put you here, and right now? To give to the one who asks, to not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And I'm not winding this up just because we're doing the Believe. You know what? If you don't want to give to the Believe campaign or to town, I don't care. Jesus calls us... I do care. That's not totally true. But this isn't what it's about. Jesus calls us to radical generosity. And we can become so full of excuses. Oh, I don't give to that because of that, or I don't give to that cause because of that. And at the end of the day, I think what we're doing is often protecting ourselves and saying, well, I give to this. Radical generosity. What are you doing right now to, rather than living an entitled life where it's all about you, take steps every day to make sacrifices? Does it hurt? Does it mean that sometimes you need to give up the luxuries that other people have? Does it mean that less vacation? Does it mean less this cool thing, that thing, less I want? For sure it does. But Jesus came and he gave up all of it. I want to wrap up with this phrase in 1 Corinthians. The young adults are studying 1 Corinthians, so if you're a young adult, I think you guys are in chapter 3 this Monday, but eventually we'll get to chapter 6. And one of the greatest things that the early church writers, like Paul in his letters, writes about is unity in the church. How do we be a community of love that's connected and is loving and where it's not all about us, we're serving one another selflessly? How do we embody grace and humility and servanthood and generosity? How do we do that? And in 1 Corinthians, he starts out, he's talking to this church that's wildly divided. They've got all these different ideas and different opinions, and they're fighting about that. Does it sound like any church time you've ever heard of? No? No? Okay. We don't do that nowadays, right? We don't fight about things. We don't disagree about things. But he's talking about this, and he's saying we need to agree and we need to be together and united in who Jesus is. When he gets to chapter 6, he starts talking about how they're taking each other to court and there are these lawsuits. And some people sometimes take this text to mean like Christians aren't allowed to go to court. And I think that's a stretch of what the passage is saying. But he is challenging what's going on in the church. And this simple phrase here in verse 7, he says, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Man, imagine that. It's like Paul shows up to our church, he's like, you guys have already lost. You've already been defeated in your mission. This phrase, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Man, that's a hard mentality. How many of us talk like that, right? Someone rips us off. Someone does something that isn't right. We lose something in life. And what do? Well, we do the normal thing in our culture. It's the same in the church as it is outside of the church. We say, I got to go make that right. I got to go get what's mine. I got to go fix that. I got to go do that. And Paul says, you know what? Maybe it'd be better to just be wronged or cheated. Like, why not just let it go? That's what Jesus is ultimately saying. When he's saying, turn the other cheek, he's like, just let it go. Get over it. Fight the injustice in the world, but when it comes to your own life, serve like Jesus did. Someone last week asked me why we're not doing an Advent series, and I said, well, some years we might, some years we won't. But here, I'll give you a 2-minute sound bite before we hop off. Jesus comes and he gets born. You guys have heard the story, and he's born in this manger. And at the time, there's this evil king who wants to kill him because he's scared of this baby, which is pretty laughable if you think about it. But he's scared of this baby, so he decides to kill all the babies. He kills them all. It's crazy. Jesus escapes. And then later on, Jesus is killed under like the same like oppressive rule of a different tyrant. What does Jesus do to fight against that in the gospel? What are the phrases he makes against that? Nothing. This is someone who like lives in that oppression and persecution, and his life was at stake. He barely escaped, and he shows up and he just says, even when the Romans are oppressing you, even when the worst people in your life are oppressing you, even when those people are being total dirtbags or jerks, turn the other cheek. Give them the coat off your back. Go the extra mile and give to the one who wants to borrow from you. That is crazy talk. It's not all about me. Listen, you don't need to remember all my 4 points this morning. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. We're about to sing the song. I'll get the band to come up. We're going to sing 2 more songs. This song we're going to sing, I'm convinced a lot of times in church that sometimes these church songs, like the lyrics are awesome, but they're written in this ideal where a lot of times I'm like, am I lying when I'm singing these lyrics? Check this out. We're going to sing these lyrics. And I want to warn you about what we're singing because it's easy to stand up and just sing the words that are on the screen, but I want you to actually think about what we're about to sing and ask yourself, can I honestly and genuinely sing those words? It says, Jesus, all for Jesus, all I am and have and ever hope to be. You can't sing those literally and seriously if you're living a life where you think it's all about you. When you wake up thinking it's all about, if every morning all of us woke up and just said, it's not all about me, that it would be so powerful. All for Jesus, all I am and ever hope to be. And then the second verse, all my ambitions and hopes and plans, I surrender these into your hands. I think we sing words like that pretty easily, and we think, okay, if I'm singing it, I'm in the zone right now. I think if we want to sing that honestly, I hope this morning that, as I think about these 4 points and these scenarios Jesus writes out, there's so much work to do in my life. I hope as we sing these that it will be an appeal to God and say, God, let me be someone who lays my life and my ambitions, my plans literally into your hands, so that when I'm wronged, that when I'm cheated, when I'm challenged, when someone hurts me, that I will respond with this restorative mindset, this kingdom mindset that you model, rather than just wanting to get back and wanting to get what's mine. So I don't know, as we sing this song, maybe you need to just spend some time praying and saying, God, help me get there. But please don't just stand up and sing words like that are blatantly not true if your plan is to go tomorrow and to live a life that's all about you. Why don't you guys stand up? I'd love to pray for you, and then we'll sing together. Jesus, you're the great example of what it means to be loving and gracious in the face of adversity when people wrong you. Help us be a town that lives that out, that models that. We love you, Jesus. Amen.